Well, hello and welcome to Transform Tuesday. I'm Dave McCormick, VP of Products and Services here at Alpha Software. And it looks like today we actually have a fairly full house. I guess a lot of people didn't have other places to be or something. But anyway, I'm very happy about that. In fact, today we have kind of a special session, and I hope it's going to kick off a bunch of other special sessions when it comes to Transform Tuesday. So let's get started. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And if someone out there could just do me a favor and in the questions box, let me know if you could see my screen and whether or not you can hear my voice. All right, excellent. Thanks very much. So I was going through my Transform Tuesday slide deck and I realized I've covered an awful lot of material. In fact, we all have. I see a lot of you have joined me for pretty much all of these sessions. But I'd like to go back and sort of review from the beginning some of the topics that we had covered. And then after that, I want to go and tell you about 3 new topics that I'd be interested in covering. But along the way, I'd love to get some feedback. So if you say, oh, I remember we went over this, but I'd really like to know some more about that in detail, by all means, let me know. You could do that by typing that into the questions box of the GoToWebinar control panel. Or of course, you could always send an email to tfservice@alphasoftware.com. That's TF as in transform, service@alphasoftware.com. So let's get started. I'm taking a look through my old slide deck, well, old and current slide deck, and I was looking at some of the key features that I introduced. Now this is over a year ago now, and we're talking about what were the key benefits of Transform. And some of the things are all the things are still applicable, but some additions have been made as well. And one of the big things is that while we do data collection apps, and that's still a big focus, we're no longer really limited to data collection apps, thanks to the fact that we now have an onboard programming language and a few other key features, file viewers and things like that, that really let you build almost any kind of app that you want. There are certain limitations to Transform. It's still, you have to log in as a user, and there are a few other reasons. And it's also still form-based compared to, say, Alpha Anywhere, which is our general purpose development tool. But it's now being used for more and more types of apps. And in fact, I have one type of app that I'm going to show you at the end, which I'm hoping in future weeks will build out into a Transform app. And that one is actually not really data collection. It's more of a diagnostic tool. So we'll get into that in a bit. So let's go through and take a look at some of the topics that we had covered in the past. Now, we had first gone over and started talking about how Transform was a great way to replace paper forms and how you could take really very complicated forms and break them down into sections and actually make even forms that are 10, 12, 15 pages long, reasonable to use on a phone. We talked about the rich data collection, how you can do things like annotate photographs, how you can do voice to text, how you can do geolocation and scanning and other types of data that isn't typically used in a paper form. And then pretty soon then, we had integrated Zapier integration with Transform. We haven't talked a lot about Zapier, I'd say, over the last several months, but it's still a feature of Alpha Anywhere, and it's still a pretty cool thing. Some of the things that we did in Zapier, for example, was we allowed you to use Google Sheets, for example, to put the data in after you had collected it out in the field. Some of the other things that we had done were reporting. Let me see, I have a reporting example here. Yeah, this one here. This was one of our earliest ones where it would send out an email report that was formatted, that was also done in Zapier using an HTML template. And Zapier did a few other things for us as well. We had it make the ability to do dispatching so that when a new row is entered into a spreadsheet, for example, we could send out a Transform form to a particular agent in the field who knows that they now have some work to do or something to complete. I'm gonna look through the rest of the Zapier things. I don't think there's a lot more there. Another thing that we had used was we started to talk about creating invoices using Alpha Anywhere and doing some reporting off of that. Let me scroll down to that section. Oops, here we go. And in this case, we use the companion product Alpha Anywhere's report writer, but there are other report writers you could use as well. And in this, we had built an example in which you could choose products from the list on the phone, enter in quantities, and calculate and create invoices from that. In future weeks, we started to dive into the permissions system, which allows you to keep forms and views and all kinds of things separate from each other. It's actually a fairly detailed system. We went through this twice. This was the first one, and we went through it also a little bit later on in a future session. And we talked about even dividing up a transform account into multiple accounts if you wanted to do that. Then, soon thereafter, the transform programming language was introduced. Now, this wasn't available right away when we first started doing Transform Tuesdays, but it started to open up a whole bunch of new possibilities. Some of the simpler things were of course that you could do calculations. You could add numbers together or compute averages or take start times and end times and find out how much time had elapsed. And we dug a little bit further into it. We started talking about how you create functions and how the language works and how to use the debugger. There's actually an on-phone debugger that lets you go through the TPL language. For those of you who have gone through the Transform User's Guide, I don't think any of this is particularly new to you, but if there are more things that you would like me to cover in this area in the future, let me know. So let me see, I'm scrolling ahead now. I'm on slide 86 of like 250. So we're making some time here. That was the debugger. That was TPL. We talked a little bit about sending SMS messages using the simple method of just using email. And we also talked about working with APIs, which the Transform programming language allowed us to now do. So you are able to now get the, So you're enabled now to call external APIs without going back through the Transform server or anything like that. So in my example, I had a weather API, but there are other APIs for looking up price lists and things like that. And one of the examples that I want to show later will be an API that actually performs optical character recognition. So what that means is you'll be able to take your phone and take a picture of something like a license plate or a serial number or something like that, and have it actually figure out what the letters and numbers are and encode them into text and put them right into your application. So that's an upcoming example. Other things we talked about were web services and how to use them and build them in Alpha Anywhere for your own particular uses. I'm going to skip by that. I know we covered that in quite a bit of detail. Let's just keep going here. That was the weather lookup example. Keep going, keep going. Went through a few overlooked features, although I think those are now encapsulated in the user's guide. And then we talked about actually using the API directly with Google Sheets. This was an example that Nikos Kazantsis, our solutions engineer, actually presented in one of them, where you could collect and capture data from Transform directly into Google Sheets, and that was while bypassing the Zapier system. We knew how to do it with Zapier, but you could do it directly by talking to the API. So we showed you how to set up the API in Google, how to get the credentials that you needed and all that, and we've covered that in past sessions as well. And I think we went through the coding on how to talk to one of the Google APIs there. Okay. So, oh, and by the way, please go ahead and type in anything into the questions window as we go about things that you'd like to see. I see someone has reported that they'd like us to do that Zapier report again, and I think actually that would be a cool one. I can actually show it maybe how to do it even without skipping the Zapier step, but having still that same output at the end. So yeah, I'd love to do that in a future one. Let me just make a quick note. Okay. Then we went on to on-device assets. That was a great new feature for Transform when it came out. And what it lets you do is it lets you store SQLite databases that you could actually query using the Transform programming language. This is terrific for doing lookups from barcode scans, for example, when you weren't sure that you would have data, when you were not sure you'd have internet connectivity. The SQLite database actually resides right on the mobile device itself. And we also talked about the different other kinds of file types you might want to include, such as PDF files and videos, and how you can actually launch them from Transform to show, for example, a particular service manual or a training video about how to fix maybe a piece of machinery that's out on the field, or to take a look at the PDF for a user's guide for something. We talked about the file viewer and how that all worked. We went through a couple of sessions of that, it looks like. And part of that involved setting up S3, which is where the data is stored. So let's skip ahead. Then we talked about the TPL examples of using doing barcode lookups against those SQL databases. So not just storing the databases, but actually doing something useful with them. And then we started to get a little bit more into the embedded business logic. And that is, based on these of some fields, could you calculate the value of another fields? Or can you perform some sort of report or something that someone can actually view right there on the screen without it going back to the transform server? We also talked about the on-submit actions, the ability when you send a record to use an on-submit builder to send a report, to call a webhook, send data directly to a SQL database if you choose to do that. You could do SMS messaging, you can merge data into a form. Well, you can read, so and all that other stuff here. In another week, we talked about how you use Transform with another system that you build, and specifically how you can use Transform as an authentication system to make sure, or vice versa, use another system as an authentication system for Transform if you choose. And there are API calls that you can use to do that. And so the example that I used was the Alpha Field Services solution, which became its own topic unto itself. But with the Alpha Field Services solution, we had a clever way of allowing the user to enter in their username and password into a web application. And then once it was confirmed, then actually going ahead and authenticating with the Alpha Anywhere API for password lookups and things like that. So it meant that basically you could build web applications that had the same username and password, a single sign-on, if you will, or at least a single set of credentials for both your web applications and for Transform, so that your users didn't have to know them both. We went over building a login control for that, and then some of the methods for doing that. And then we spent a fair amount of time going over the Field Services application. Field Services application is a GitHub project. I keep saying it'll be released shortly, but we will give actually anyone who's interested in the GitHub link if they want to send us email to tfservice@alphasoftware.com. We will let you do that. What this was a Alpha Anywhere application that was built using Transform. And so Transform was responsible for all the data collection and for alerting users when they've got new forms and things like that. But instead of using Transform Central, which of course is the web portal that comes with Alpha Transform, we used this, this other replacement one. So you could, for example, take a look at records that were submitted. You could dispatch new records. You could do reports. You could see where people, for example, your trucks and stuff were on a map based on the last time that they logged in from their mobile device. We had all kinds of dashboards and reports. And in a future version, which is coming up shortly, we're actually going to put the user management right in here as well. So there may be no real reason ever to go to the Transform Central except when you set up your form for the first time. In another topic, we talked about security, and currently in its implementation and in the shared tenancy implementation, we do believe that we do have a certain amount of security, but we still don't recommend it for storing personal health information and for credit card numbers. But we did talk about what you would need to do to harden your Transform implementation so that you can do that. And in fact, there are people who are now running on-premise versions of Transform specifically so that they could take more control than having simply a cloud application. So we talked about what's encrypted, what isn't, how you get to it, and all of that. And we are all basing it on the idea that, look, we know that we can't just pretend security isn't there, and we can't say, well, only we know how the system works, so don't worry, it's secure, because we know that that's bound for failure. So we went through all of the different scenarios and basically how to make Transform bulletproof if you've got some super secret secure data that you need to be protected for reasons of usually for legal reasons. What else did we go over? We went over, okay, appliance side versus cloud. We went over various numbers of dispatching examples. In other words, how, including the new concept of the dispatch queue, where an administrator, instead of assigning a project to a particular worker out in the field, instead they assign that project to a queue. And when the user logs in, they look at the queue and say, yeah, I can handle that. And they claim the ticket from the queue and it becomes theirs. So that was a feature that came out, I think, in the last release. Speaking of releases, when I get off this session today, I'm going to be doing more beta testing in our now beta candidate and possibly release candidate for Alpha Transform. So for those of you who are wondering where we are in the process of getting new updates to the software, we are darn close. So if we don't find anything major this week, it'll be in your hands for testing probably by Monday of next week would be my estimate at this point, just to let you know. We talked about a new feature in which you could dispatch in bulk from Excel, where you would get a template, you would fill it in, and if you had 50 records that you wanted to push out or 100 records you could push out, it was just another option of doing dispatch. We went back over permissions because that created all kinds of confusion, talking about what's the difference between a status and a role and all that. If anyone would like me to go over that again, we can certainly do that, or you can maybe look back, or I can point you to, I think, the best of the webinars on that one. We talked about doing calculations with time, which is an extremely useful thing, especially if you are calculating how long something has spent on a project and maybe how much time needs to be billed to a customer or something like that. Later on, we went into the notion of extract, transform, and load, which is a way of handling your Alpha Transform data without relying purely on the Alpha Transform API. In other words, a system in which you have a second backup copy of your transform data that you keep in a SQL database, allowing you to perform much more sophisticated and frankly faster queries against that data for dashboarding, reporting, and for other purposes as well. Again, we had talked about the Alpha Field Services solution and what the different pieces of it were. And again, a little bit more about the dispatch. And let's see, what else had we been covering recently? This again has to do with extract, transfer, and load, where we decide to put things directly into a database. We talked about how Alpha Anywhere now includes transform as what we call a first-class citizen when it comes to data connectivity. So for example, new reports can be built directly against transform without making your own API calls or really doing any programming anymore, which allowed us to do a session on doing reporting without programming. The last one that I recalled doing was actually a couple, or almost the last one I recalled doing is the responsive layout. And that was, how do I make my forms look good on all the different screen sizes? And an example of that was, taking something where, look, there's clearly enough room in a design like this to make first name and last name fit on the same field, and city, state, and zip all fit together. So how do you do it when there is enough room? And we showed you how the responsive design stuff worked in that. And lastly, we went over initialization commands, which are your ability to set default values to fields when you first, when the form is first opened up. So that's that so far. If there are any of these topics you'd like to see any of them anywhere, that would be great. Or you'd like to see more thing. So a couple weeks ago, okay, here's a good one. A couple weeks ago, you presented using action buttons to record GPS position and time with action buttons. I created that, but they seem to be a slight delay in GPS when I open the form. Is there a time for the GPS to start happening on the form, or is there something else? Yes, I would be happy to go into that. It turns out that there are some parameters that we can set that make GPS operate faster. There is in fact a time delay built into the GPS, but you have control over that time delay. If you want to find out the answer before next week, send an email to tfservice@alphasoftware.com. Otherwise, I can show everyone how that works next week and how to supply a parameter to do that. All right, moving down, we have what's next. So here are three things that I was thinking of covering, and you guys can tell me whether this is a good idea or a terrible idea. It's okay, you can tell me if it's a terrible idea, and I'll go through them. The first is using Alpha Transform as a diagnostic tool as opposed to simply a data collection tool. And I actually have a pretty good example of what I mean by that. Let me pop over here to Safari. And I think most of you on the call are familiar with our COVID-19 risk assessment app that we released a couple weeks ago. If you want it, all you have to do is go to mycovid19risk.com tfservice.com. And it is, well, it's a mobile app. It's really just a web application that has been mobile optimized. So it looks good on screens as small as the old iPhone 4. We didn't go any before that. It looks good on web. And it's a simple way of determining what your risks are for catching COVID-19 and what your and whether your symptoms might be indicative that you have COVID-19 or some other thing. So this was created by a doctor in New York during the time of the COVID peak, or just before it, which is happening right now. And he created it because he really wanted it for his patients and to get it out there. It's actually appeared now in Bloomberg Radio, it's appeared in the Boston Globe, it's appeared in the Irish Times, and it's actually a cool little diagnostic app. Let me show you how the app works, and we'll talk about how we would build this in TransForm. So the application just basically asks you a series of questions. I'm going to give it some crazy answers to these questions so that I'm at high risk as possible. I'm going to say, yes, I've traveled. I've traveled to all of these places. Were the people who there, were they quarantined? Yes. Did they test positive for the virus? Yes. Were they treated with medication? No. Have I traveled? Yes. I've traveled everywhere. Were you quarantined? No, I wasn't. That's it. Continue. I'm going to say I take the train to work. I also take a carpool, and people are sick, and so on. And I'm going to keep going. And they're going to ask what medical conditions. Let me just put in a whole bunch of them. And now I'm also going to tell them about a bunch of medications that fortunately I'm not taking. And then it's going to ask me how I feel. I'm going to say I'm sick. Do I have a fever? Yes. It's pretty high. It happened right away. Yes. Dry cough. So you can tell I filled this out about 1 billion times over the last 2 weeks, as have the team. Let's say whenever, first day. No. Okay, I think that's enough. No other symptoms. Now, okay, this is the bad news. So what's happened basically in this application, and this was not done, all of this is actually being done client side for those of you who are Alpha Anywhere folks. So basically this is a UX component that got loaded once, and all of the rules, all of the questions, everything are actually contained right in here. So once it hits the server once, it actually collects all the information. Everything else is done client side. So here's what happened. It said there's a high probability that you've contracted COVID-19. Your symptoms appear to be related. Here are all the reasons to the questions. Here are some social distancing things, and that's it. So now this is a diagnostic, of course, for a person, but you could have diagnostics for a machine. You could have diagnostics for a printer, for example. You know, do the lights come on? Is it plugged in? Do you have toner in it? And you could have diagnostics where the rules change depending on the type of machine, for example, that you are using. So at the end of it, you know, you may or may not be submitting anything other than I found and fixed the problem, but you may have used that form for quite a lot of the actual fixing of the problem, because it could be pre-wired with information that's useful to the technician that's out on the field. So that's one possibility, which I'd like to cover. Let's go through the other two. Let's actually jump to the third one, the OCR Examples one. This one, I can come up with a working example, I think, pretty quickly. And it's really neat, the idea that you can hold your phone up to a collection of text or numbers or things like that, and have it figure out what the text or numbers are and put it properly into the fields so that you could go search for that data later on. Like I said, license plates, serial numbers, all kinds of things would be good qualifying candidates for taking photographs and turning them into OCR text. And then the last one, last but not least, is the idea of an Internet of Things transform robot. So imagine a small device, Raspberry Pi or Arduino or some other microcontroller, if you're familiar with that term, whose job it is to measure things. Maybe it measures whether people have come into the room, whether or not someone's left the lights on, what the temperature is in the room, or if it's outside, what the wind speed is, or maybe it needs to take a picture from time to time of what's going on. Using this, using an Arduino or Raspberry Pi, you could easily collect that information and then perform an API call right into the TransForm API interface and create a brand new record that's been filled out not by a human, but by your IoT TransForm robot. If you find that of interest, I'd be happy to do an example of that one as well. So we're all at the end, and someone says, which ones are you interested in? Okay, so definitely, someone says all three, but definitely the OCR example seems to be the key one so far. Do we have any other votes or any other suggestions from the audience today? I have an awful lot of people here today, so I'm sure you guys have got good ideas. I'll give you a minute. But if you do think of something that you would like me to cover, you can go ahead and send an email to tfservice@alphasoftware.com, and I'd be happy to look into it for you. Okay, got a vote for all three. We got a vote for IoT. We got another vote for OCR, which seems to be winning by a vote. So that's great. Oh, no, and another IoT as well. Great. Well, I know what to do. I'm going to get busy this weekend. Fantastic. Well, that's it for me. I'll switch back to camera, which I've been doing recently because a lot of people are staying home and they don't get to see people. I'm not sure seeing me is a big improvement, but may as well do it. So thank you very much for showing up. I hope to see you guys next Tuesday where we tackle one of these new 3 issues. In the meantime, if you have any questions, please send them to tfservice@alphasoftware.com. If you would like links to anything, of course, send them also to tfservice@alphasoftware.com, and I'll be happy to send them off. Take care and have a great week. Bye-bye.